Okay, so natural selection. Um, the idea here is that our ancestors may have found a way to survive in a harsh environment by avoiding stress. And so one of the things that depression might do for us that's actually positive is that it gets us to withdraw from stressful situations, to give ourselves an opportunity to recoup and get our energy back in line so that we're ready to face you know other stressors. It also helps to get other people to pitch in and help to lower our stress. So it might be that we have a natural predisposition, thanks to natural selection, to withdraw when we're in the face of stressful things. So depressed behavior allows us to, for one thing, conserve energy. If you're in a stressed out situation, you may be consuming too many calories and things like that and overtiring yourself. So depression helps us to withdraw back. It helps us to avoid conflicts and other things that could be risky. If you're really you've been in situations where you've had to work with a group or a team and you're under stress, for whatever reason, and maybe you or somebody else snapped at somebody on the team and kind of contributed to a little team discord. When you withdraw, when you're under stress and display depressive symptoms, well, clearly you're not interacting with anyone, so that reduces that risk. It also lets us focus on what's important and get rid of those unattainable goals that maybe we had been striving for, that maybe it's pointless, we shouldn't be wasting our time doing that. And so it helps us to see like the big picture, helps us to realize what's important. And then also depression can give us time to contemplate things. Sometimes we need to really mull things over, and in our everyday life there's too much buzzing and coming and going and social niceties and all these things that can interfere with our ability to really process information deeply and quietly. So some people have argued that these symptoms, same thing as I said with anxiety, though, we're not saying these are that major depression is advantageous. We're saying that some of the behaviors that are part of depression can be traced back to behaviors that could have been beneficial. What we're talking about with major depression is blowing it out of proportion and displaying behaviors that are no longer adaptive and actually are maladaptive. Okay, well, let's move on to schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is probably one of our most misrepresented disorders in the media in particular. A lot of times people say that when you're confused, oh, what are you, schizophrenic because you can't decide whether you like, peach or raspberry or something. That's not schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is when your mind has actually made a split from reality. So your mind can't tell the difference between what's happening just inside of your head and what's happening out in the actual world. It has nothing to do with multiple personality disorder or anything like that. Schizophrenia is sometimes referred to as psychosis, not to be confused with psychopath. Psychopath is a whole different thing. Psychosis is when you've had that break from reality and you can't tell what's real and what's imaginary. So some of the symptoms. Now this is just sort of like common symptoms. Most people who have schizophrenia don't have all of these, but common symptoms include things like disorganized thinking, delusional thinking. Delusions are when you believe things that aren't true. So if you believe that you're Napoleon, that would be a delusion. Disturbed perceptions are often referred to as hallucinations. Disturbed perceptions are when you are perceiving something that isn't really there. So you might be hearing voices, or you might see something that is not really there. And then our final really common symptom is inappropriate emotions and actions. You may have a complete lack of emotion. We call that flat affect. You might be laughing when everybody else is crying, something like that. Inappropriate actions. You don't mind flapping your arms or saying weird things, stuff like that. You get this group of behaviors that are unusual. All right, so let's talk about the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and the negative. Now remember back when we learned that B.F. Skinner meant positive as in adding and negative as in subtracting? Well, here we are again with positive means we're going to add something, and negative means we're going to be taking something away. So none of these are considered good or beneficial symptoms. These are either we're adding something new in the positive symptoms, or we're taking away something that should be there in the negative symptoms. So positive symptoms would be things like hallucinations, where you're perceiving something that's not really there, delusions, where you're believing something that's not true, disorganized thought, where oftentimes you end up with speech patterns that are really odd. You might say everything in rhyme, or you might say all the words in the sentence out of order but with the correct intonation. So nonsensical speech is a manifestation of disorganized thought. And then bizarre behaviors, like I said, flapping your arms, stuff like that. Now, taking away things that we would expect to be present would be things like flat affect. That's where you just have an absence of emotion. Reduced social interaction, where you just don't want to be around other people, you don't want to talk to the people who are there. You may just sit there and ignore everybody else and just sit there and stare forward. Or you might rock, which is one of those bizarre behaviors. Anhedonia is where you don't take pleasure in things that other people enjoy doing. So nothing's really fun. Avolition means that you don't have the motivation to do anything that you normally used to do. Like you just can't get yourself up, get dressed, and get to work anymore. I've just got like no kickstart to get me moving. Alogia is no talking. So you may have a person who does not speak. And then catatonia is where they don't move. They get stuck in a posture, and they'll keep that posture for hours on end. So the positive symptoms are when we're going to add new problematic behaviors, and negative is when we're going to take away healthy behaviors. So some types of schizophrenia are mostly the addition of problematic behaviors. Other types of schizophrenia are more commonly negative behaviors, where we're taking away healthy things. Okay, now there are subtypes of schizophrenia. I've been talking very generally so far, but there are subtypes of schizophrenia, like paranoid. Whoops, sorry, pushed a button. Paranoid schizophrenics who tend to have delusions of either grandeur, where they think they're somebody more important than they really are, like I'm Napoleon or the King of England or something like that. They also have delusions of persecution, where they think that people are going to get them. The FBI is after them, or the CIA, or MI5, or something like that is after them. The disorganized schizophrenic tends to have the disorganized thinking and the speech problems that I mentioned. Catatonic, they of course have catatonia. They often have alogia, avolition, anhedonia. They have catatonics tend to have all the negative symptoms. Undifferentiated means that they may have symptoms from more than one subtype. So they may have delusions and alogia, something like that. And then residual is when you had schizophrenia full blown and now you're mostly better, but with a few symptoms. Not enough symptoms to still be diagnosed, but still with some quirky behaviors that make you atypical. Okay, so where does schizophrenia come from? When I was a student, they were still talking about the social explanation that, well, Freud introduced the idea that your mom could cause you to become schizophrenic. He actually had a term called a schizophrenogenic mother, who, through her poor parenting skills and her distant behavior, could cause her child to become schizophrenic. I'm pleased to report we've abandoned that theory, and now we're going to focus on biological explanations. So biology says that you may be predisposed to develop schizophrenia. So one explanation is genes. Here's a chart. Again, we have a cross-cultural chart here. For some reason, the U.S. isn't on it at all. And here what we're seeing is on the y-axis is the concordance rate. If you have a twin who's been diagnosed, this is your probability that you would also be diagnosed. So if you're a fraternal twin, If you're a fraternal twin, you're in the blue bars. Remember, fraternal twins share 50% of their genes, and identical twins share 100% of their genes. So in the blue bars, you can see that the concordance rate is significantly lower than the identical twins. The identical twins are much more likely to match on that. So if one of them has schizophrenia, it looks like if we average all these countries out, we'll be at about 50% of the time. The other identical twin will also be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Whereas with the fraternal twins, after you average everything out, it comes out to about 20% probability if your twin has been diagnosed that you would also be diagnosed. So identical twins are much more likely to match on this disorder. So that kind of implies a genetic underpinning. But I'd like to point out that's 50%, right? You share 100% of your genes, but only a 50% matching on this disorder. So something else has got to be in play besides just purely genes. So what else? Brain structures. Here we have a schizophrenic on the left and a person without schizophrenia on the right. And what we're looking at is a slice of the brain from, they slice sort of from ear to ear. So, and we're looking into the brain from the front. And you can see that those butterfly-shaped ventricles in the middle with the red arrow pointing at it are much larger in the schizophrenic than they are in the non-schizophrenic. Not exactly sure how that happens or why, or what it means exactly, but it is something that we know is consistent. Schizophrenics tend to have larger ventricles than non-schizophrenics. Here's a PET scan, and now this cut is from front to back. So now we're looking down onto into their brains. Their noses are pointing upwards, and the schizophrenics again on the left and the non-schizophrenics on the right. Where you see those black bits in the schizophrenic, that's the ventricle. And you'll notice you don't see that. There's nothing black in the non-schizophrenic. The black on the schizophrenic brain is we're actually seeing the fluid rather than any brain tissue there. So, and you'll notice around the ventricle, see the purple areas? Those are areas of very low activity going on around the ventricles. Whereas in the non-schizophrenic, you can see the shape of the ventricle. There's just it's not as big, so you're not seeing the water, and you're seeing more activity around it. So that's kind of interesting, right? But the other thing is just overall, it appears that there's more activity in the non-schizophrenic than there is in the schizophrenic. And if we focus specifically on the frontal lobe, which is the part at the top of the head there, you can see red and orange in the non-schizophrenic, and just only a little bit of yellow in the schizophrenic, right? A little tiny bit of orange in the schizophrenic. One big difference between schizophrenics and non-schizophrenics is the amount of activity in the frontal lobe. The non-schizophrenic has a lot more activity going on that frontal lobe. And remember what the frontal lobe does. It gives us our momentary awareness. It gives us our ability to plan and judge. It also controls what we're going to say. Right? Broca's area is up there in the frontal lobe. So the low levels of activity in the frontal lobe explain things like speech problems, being able to produce speech. It explains impulsive behaviors or weird, bizarre behaviors that the person might have, because the frontal lobe would normally tell you not to do those embarrassing things in front of people. And then it also explains the delusions that a person might have, because these incorrect beliefs about who I am and who might be chasing me and stuff like that tend to stem from the frontal lobe's activity and awareness of where I am in space and who I am and those kinds of consistent thoughts. So the other thing, I don't have a picture that can depict it, but I stuck a little arrow to show you where. There are too many dopamine receptors in the schizophrenic. I put a little yellow arrow to indicate it's in the temporal area, really. I kind of pointed at the cerebellum for some odd reason. There are too many dopamine receptors in the temporal lobes, which is where our auditory cortex is. That auditory cortex relies on dopamine for transmitting information, and so a lot of schizophrenics have auditory hallucinations, and those auditory hallucinations might be attributable to having too many dopamine receptors that cause the brain to think it received a message when it really didn't receive a message. It generated that message itself. Okay, so some risk factors that up your likelihood of developing schizophrenia. Low birth weight babies are more likely to grow up to develop schizophrenia. Mom having had maternal diabetes or gestational diabetes. Dad being over 40. Having experienced famine during the pregnancy. Being deprived of oxygen during the delivery. And mom having been exposed to the flu virus are all factors that increase the likelihood that a baby will grow up to, by the time, if you're male, around 19, to start displaying symptoms. If you're female, it's more likely it'll be about 29 when you start to display symptoms. So there's something about, the brain fully maturing and maybe the demands of adulthood combining to cause the revealing of these characteristics. We know that it's not due to drug use. It used to be believed that if you used LSD or something like that, you could cause schizophrenia in a person who otherwise wasn't going to get it. They think you have to have the genetic predisposition or the brain structures present for drug use to at all be related. Drugs will not cause it in a normally healthy person. It's not due to traumatic stress. They used to think that maybe going to war would be enough to cause schizophrenia, but now they realize that the young men who they studied during Vietnam who came home from the war with schizophrenia probably just happened to be in the prime age when they came home. That they happened to be in Vietnam when they were 19 years old and were going to display the disorder if they were going to display the disorder. It's also not due to poverty. A lot of times people thought that certain neighborhoods would have higher rates of schizophrenia, but it has not panned out at all. It's nothing superficial like this. It seems to be a combination of genes and environment and some kind of, we're not exactly sure. Okay, let's go ahead and stop here and we'll come back in the next segment and talk about dissociative disorders.